Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Hi student. This video will explain about a transport system starting with 8.1 mammalian heart and its regulation. In this subtopic, we are going to learn about the initiation of heartbeat, then explain cardiac cycle. We are going to explain about ECG, emphasizing on the P wave, QRS complex and T wave. And then we are going to explain factors that affect the heartbeat, which includes pH and temperature. The main components of our circulatory system includes the heart, of course, the organ, and then our blood vessels that carry the blood, and then the blood itself. Our heart begins beating at 4 weeks after fertilization, and it will not stop until our death count. So, the heart is a hollow muscular organ. It is positioned in the center of the thorax, but it is a bit slanted to the left of our thorax. This is a diagram of a heart. As we can see, there are two sides of our heart. There are two sides. I will explain later. And this is the structure. The heart is covered by a pericardium. There are two sides of a heart, left and right, and then each side of our heart are divided into two types of chambers. So in all, inclusively, we have 4 chambers. Our heart have 4 chambers. The upper part of our heart is called atrium or atria as in plural. So we have left and right atria, left and right atrium, and then the lower chamber is the ventricle. We have left ventricles and right ventricles. So the left atria receive oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then while right atrium will receive deoxygenated blood. Left ventricles receive oxygenated blood from a pump from the atrium to the whole body, while right ventricle receive deoxygenated blood from the right atrium and pump the blood to the lungs. Based on structure, we can see that atria walls are thinner than ventricles, and to compare between left and right ventricles, the left ventricle have 3 times thicker wall than the right ventricle. Why do the atria have less muscular walls than the ventricles? Functionally, atria only pump blood into the ventricle, so it is a short distance pumping, while ventricles have much thicker walls because they need more force to develop higher pressure to force the blood out of the heart into the lung or into throughout the body. So the distance of the journey of the blood is longer. While right ventricle has thinner wall than the left ventricle because right ventricle only force blood into the lung, while left ventricle will force blood throughout the whole body. This is the right side and this is the left side. There is a muscle in between right and left chambers. It is called septum. So the parts of the septum that separate the atria are called interatrial septum, while the parts of the septum that separate the ventricle is called interventricular septum. We have the atrial, right atrium, left ventricle, and this is the pulmonary artery that will bring blood to the lung. While this is the left atrium, and this is the left ventricle, which pump blood into the aorta, then throughout the body. In between atrium and ventricle, there are valves separate the content of the atrium, the chamber of atrium and ventricle. The valve is called atrioventricular valve, but to be specific, for each side of the heart, the name of the valve is specific. The right atrioventricular valve is called tricuspid valve, which separate the right atrium and right ventricle, while bicuspid valve or mitral valve separate the left atrium and the left ventricle. The calf's free ends are attached to the chordae tendineae, holding the atrioventricular valves in place. Okay, in the pulmonary artery valve and in the pulmonary artery and aortic, there are also valves that separate the content of the blood from returning or flowing back into the ventricles. In the pulmonary artery, the valve in both blood vessel is called semilunar valve. Arteries are usually thicker than veins, and they are interconnected by capillary. The veins usually have valves that will prevent backflow of the blood. Let's look at the initiation of heartbeat. One heartbeat consists of one complete sequence of pumping which involve contraction of the heart muscle, while filling is when the blood fills in the chamber of the heart. It is done during relaxation of the muscle. So during the contraction phase is called systole, while the relaxation phase is called diastole. A normal human at rest have a pulse of about 75 beats per minute. The vertebrate heart is myogenic, meaning that the contraction is spontaneous and it is independent of the nervous stimulation, meaning that the heart can start beating by their own. They do not depend on the nervous system, on the brain, on the nervous system. The continuous the rhythm, contraction and relaxation is continuous. So cardiac muscle does not depend to start beating, does not depend on nervous stimulation to start beating, because cardiac muscle itself has their own nodal tissues, which is called as a node, to start the to produce their own impulse. The initiation of heartbeat includes 5 components: the sinoatrial node, also known as pacemaker, atrioventricular node or AV node, bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, and then Purkinje fiber. So the 5 components are SA node, or pacemaker. Then we have AV node at the interatrial septum. Then we have the bundle of his. Then bundle of his is divided into left and right bundle branches, and then we have the Purkinje fibers in the area of ventricles wall. So each heartbeat is initiated by the sinoatrial node, or known as pacemaker. In Malay we call it perentak. SA node is located in the wall of the right atrium near the opening of superior vena cava. SA node generate impulse, then the impulse from the SA node is spread throughout the walls of the atria, causing atria to contract. Then when atria contract, it will pump blood into ventricles. So the impulse will be recorded by ECG and produce this wave, showing an electrical activity. While atria is in contraction, the impulse finally reach the atrioventricular node, the AV node. The AV node which is located in the wall between the right and left atria. When the impulse arrives at the AV node, the impulse will be delayed for about 0.1 second. So the delay will allow the blood from both atria to flow completely into the ventricles. So if the ventricle contract before the blood is fully filled in the ventricles, then it will be a problem, because there will be some blood will remain in the atria. So the ventricle needs to relax, receive the blood completely, then it will contract. Then impulse from AV node transmitted to the bundle of his here, and then from bundle of his the impulse is divided into the left and right bundle branches. So from the left and right bundle branches, the impulse will be spread throughout the ventricles through Purkinje fiber. So both ventricles will contract simultaneously from heart apex. Okay, this is the end of the heart. The ventricle should contract from the apex upwards, cannot from the middle parts. So the contraction from apex will ensure all of the blood in the ventricles will be pumped into the aorta or pulmonary arteries. So this is the flow that shows this flow chart that shows the flow of the impulse generated from SA node. Cardiac cycle. It is a sequence of events of a heartbeat in which the cardiac muscle contract and relax alternately and continuously. One complete cardiac cycle takes about 0.8 seconds. So to explain cardiac cycle, we are going to use more of the words systole and diastole. So during systole, blood is pumped because the chambers are contracting. The heart muscle is contracting, while diastole, the chambers are filled with blood because the muscle is relaxing. There are three phases of atrial systole. Three phases of cardiac cycles. The first one is atrial systole, ventricular systole, and then ventricular and atrial diastole. It should happen in sequence. But when explaining, we can start with either atrial systole or ventricular and atrial diastole. According to this diagram, it starts the cardiac cycle, explaining cardiac cycle with atrial and ventricular diastole. Then the sequence goes to the atrial systole, and the last one is ventricular systole. Let's look at the explanation. Atrial systole is when both atria contract simultaneously while the ventricles relax. So when atria contract, blood from the atria will be pumped into the ventricles. So during this phase, about 30% of blood is pumped out of atria. Please bear in mind, there is only 30% remains. 30% of blood that enter the heart, only 30% remain in the atria during atrial systole. This is because 70%, the rest of the blood, has already flowed into the ventricles passively before atria contract. So when atria contract, blood pressure in the atria increase. The blood pressure is higher than blood pressure in the ventricles. So when explaining cardiac cycle, what happened at each phases, we have to relate with the contraction, what happened there, and the increase of blood pressure or the decrease of blood pressure. Because of the higher pressure in the atria, it will open. It will make the valve, atrioventricular valve, to remain open. That's why blood can completely pump into the ventricles. And during this phase, semilunar valves will remain closed. So no blood will flow from ventricles into the aorta and pulmonary artery. So when the impulse arrives at the ventricles, the Purkinje fiber, so ventricular is having systole phase. Ventricular will contract while atria will relax. So when ventricle contract, the blood is pumped out of ventricles into the aorta and pulmonary artery. Okay, how can blood pass through go into the aorta and pulmonary artery? This is because blood pressure in the ventricles is higher than the blood pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery due to the contraction of the ventricles. So the semilunar valves open due to the high blood pressure in the ventricles, while the high blood pressure in the ventricles forces the tricuspid and bicuspid valve to close. The closure of the ventricles, the closure of the tricuspid and bicuspid valve produce a loop sound, the first sound of the heartbeat. The first sound of the heartbeat is loop due to the closing of tricuspid and bicuspid valve because the blood recoil against the closed AV valve, so it produces the loop sound. In the third phase, both atria and ventricles are relaxing, so the relaxation of the chambers will allow blood from vena cava and the pulmonary and the pulmonary vein enter the chambers. So when the atrial and ventricular diastole, the blood pressure in the ventricle, of course, decrease, causing the aorta and pulmonary artery has higher blood pressure. Then the blood pressure in the aorta and arteries will close the semilunar valve. The closure of the semilunar valve will produce the second sound of the heartbeat, which is the doop sound. Okay, doop sound. The doop sound due to the vibration of closing of semilunar valve. So the closing of semilunar valve will prevent a backflow of blood in the aorta and the pulmonary artery into the ventricles. So during relaxation of atria and ventricles, blood from vena cava and pulmonary vein enter atria passively. Sebab apa pasif? Sebab masa tu tengah relax, tak ada paksaan untuk darah itu masuk ke dalam chamber, tapi memang dah masuk. Okay? Sebab blood pressure in the ventricle, in the atria is low. So as blood enter both atria, the blood pressure in atria gradually increase due to the volume increase. So the blood pressure in the atria increase, opening the atrioventricular valve. So it is because they are relaxing, so the valve is like automatic to open due to the force of the small force from the blood. Small force of the blood. The blood that enter the atria will push the tricuspid and bicuspid valve. So during atrial and ventricular diastole, about 70% of blood will flow from atria into ventricle passively. Kenapa passive? Because there is no contraction of atria and there is no force. Tak ada tekanan yang tinggi untuk menolak darah, memaksa darah. So the blood flow passively. During atrial systole, all blood is pumped into ventricles. During ventricular systole, atria will relax while blood is pumped into aorta and pulmonary artery. Then during atrial and ventricular diastole, blood from vena cava and pulmonary veins enter atria. ECG, electrocardiogram. ECG is a recording of electrical waves that represent the electrical current generated throughout the cardiac cycle. Electrical waves or electrical activity of the cardiac cycle. The instrument is called electrocardiograph, producing electrocardiogram. During contraction, when we talk about impulse, it is associated with the word depolarization and repolarization. So depolarize when the muscle depolarize, meaning that the muscle is contracting. Repolarization, the muscle will be relaxing. So in terms of electrical activity, we use the word depolarization and repolarization. If we relate with the cardiac cycle, between cardiac cycle and the ECG, in ECG there are three things that you need to memorize: the P wave, the QRS complex, and then the T wave. So during P wave, it is associated with the depolarization of the atria. Then QRS complex is associated with the ventricular depolarization, and T wave associated with ventricular repolarization. So during atrial depolarization, meaning that atrial contract. QRS complex, ventricles contract. Ventricular systole. While T wave is during ventricles, ventricular and atrial diastole. Okay, so you have to know what is these three parts of the ECG and relate with the cardiac cycle. Okay, to explain about the wave based on impulse activity. This is the P wave, is when the impulse is generated by the SA node and spread through the atria. So atria undergo contraction because atria depolarize. When the impulse arrive at AV node, it is being delayed. That's why there is no wave here. It is called PQ segment. This is PQ. So this shows the journey, the travels of the impulse spreading until it reach AV node, then delayed. Ventricular depolarization shows a QRS, produce a QRS complex. Ventricles during which ventricles contract. So the magnitude of the impulse is higher than the P wave. So it is a logical explanation because ventricle contraction produce higher pressure than the atria. Then at T wave, ventricular repolarization. The ventricle is being relaxed. No impulse, so the ventricles relax and ventricles undergo diastole. So this is actually diastole of the ventricles and the atria. So this is the no electrical activity which allow the blood to flow from this blood to flow into the atria and the ventricles during the third phase of the cardiac cycle, the atria and ventricular diastole. The P wave is when the SA node generates impulse, as I've explained before. Then the impulse spread to both atria, causing depolarization of atria. Impulse spread to AV node. From AV node, impulse will spread to bundle of his right and left bundle branches and Purkinje fiber. That's why we have a slight negative activity here. Impulse spread during QRS complex, impulse spread to both ventricles, causing ventricles to contract due to depolarization. While at this phase, atria is relaxing because the atria is undergoing repolarization. The T wave, repolarization of ventricles, means that the ventricles is relaxing, which is the recovery period of the ventricles. Why ECG is important? It can be used to diagnose heart problem. So a heightened P wave can indicate an enlarged atrium, while heightened R wave, maybe a higher, will indicate enlarged ventricles. ECG also can be used to diagnose abnormalities in cardiac rhythm. Normal heartbeat shows frequency, normal frequency. This is a higher frequency, and this is slow heartbeat, less frequency, lower frequency. Also, ECG important to detect presence of fetus. Okay, it is supposed to be the mother is supposed to have T wave here, but the fetal cardiac activity overcome the readings of the T wave of the mother. Factors affecting heartbeat rate. First is the pH of blood. When pH of blood decrease, the rate of heartbeat will increase. An example is when we do activity or exercise. So that's why when we are exercising, our heartbeat should increase. This is to ensure that more deoxygenated blood is pumped to the lungs, so carbon dioxide that is produced during the exercise is released through exhalation. The second factor is body temperature. When our body temperature increase, example when we are having fever or start to having fever, the heartbeat will start to beat faster. In order to regulate body temperature, because when we have faster heartbeat, our blood will circulate in higher rate. It will be circulated more throughout the skin, so the heat in the blood can radiate from our body to the environment. Heartbeat rate can be controlled. The rate can be controlled, but the production of the heartbeat, the initiation of the heartbeat, is done by the nodes in the SA node in the heart muscle. So heart is myogenic. They do not need nerve impulse to initiate each contraction, but it can be regulated by cardio-regulatory center in the medulla oblongata. The rate of heartbeat can be regulated by both nervous and hormonal system. So there are two regions of cardio-regulatory center. The cardio-acceleratory center. Accelerate means fasten the heartbeat, while cardio-inhibitory is to inhibit the quicken pace study. So it will inhibit. The nervous system includes hypothalamus in the brain. The stimulus that tells hypothalamus we need to the stimulus for hypothalamus is our body temperature, emotions, feelings, and stress, while chemoreceptor helps detect changes in chemical composition, such as the concentration of proton, hydrogen ion, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or even low pH. Usually those three are very related. A nervous system includes two types of nerves, parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. Both nerves have antagonistic effect. Sympathetic nerves will quicken the rate of heartbeat, increase the rate of heartbeat, while parasympathetic will reduce or decrease the rate of heartbeat. Para from the word paralysis. Paralysis. So parasympathetic nerve will paralyze the effect of increasing heartbeat. So it decrease rate of heartbeat. When CAC, cardio acceleratory center, is stimulated, meaning, for example, our temperature increase, impulse is sent to SA node via sympathetic nerve. The CAC will detect the increase of the temperature. Then it will send impulse to SA node via sympathetic nerve. So when SA node receive impulse from sympathetic nerve, SA node know that it needs to increase the heartbeat rate. So how does SA node know sympathetic nerve sending impulse? It is because the neurotransmitter sent by sympathetic nerve is a specific hormone. A specific neurotransmitter, which is norepinephrine. Due to the presence of norepinephrine, the rate of heartbeat will increase. When pH is lower than set point, meaning that we have so many carbon dioxide in our blood system, hydrogen ions is increased, pH is decreased. So chemoreceptor will detect the changes, the decrease in pH. So it will send impulse to CAC, then CAC will send impulse via sympathetic nerve to SA node. So due to the presence of norepinephrine, SA node will increase the rate of cardiac muscle contraction. thus rate of heartbeat will increase. But when cardioinhibitory center is stimulated, impulse will be sent to SA node via parasympathetic. So since parasympathetic will secrete acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, the SA node will detect the presence of acetylcholine and then decrease the rate of heartbeat. So for example, when blood body temperature is lower than the normal temperature, hypothalamus will detect the changes. Then it send impulse to CIC. CIC will send impulse to parasympathetic nerve to SA node. Then presence of acetylcholine will cause SA node to decrease rate of cardiac muscle contraction. Okay, based on hormonal system, there are two types of hormones that can affect the rate of heartbeat. The epinephrine or adrenaline dengan norepinephrine. Both hormones are secreted by adrenal glands in response to body temperature and pH change. So both hormones will increase the frequency of impulse production by SA node. Then increase the contraction of cardiac muscle. But hormonal system, it just involves the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Okay. For example, body temperature increase, hypothalamus detect, then it will send impulse to CAC. So CAC will send impulse to adrenal glands. Then adrenal gland will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So when the blood arrive at SA node will detect presence of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these two hormones will stimulate SA node to increase the rate of impulse production. Okay. So CAC has two ways of communicating with SA node. One through sympathetic nerve, one is through bloodstream. But both involve epinephrine, norepinephrine. Same goes to pH. When pH decrease, chemoreceptor will send impulse to CAC telling that pH is decreased. Then CAC will send impulse to adrenal gland. Then adrenal gland will secrete more epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So SA node will detect the presence of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Thus, it will increase the rate of impulse production. Okay, thank you.